You look at a business like ours, you're talking about 150 to $200 million of capital that you're going to need. How do we get to that quantum of capital? Where is it coming from? What do we need to prove in order to be able to make that case to that type of investor? There's just the reality, entrepreneurs in this space where you're venture capital driven, 80% of your time, you're raising money.
Welcome back, everybody. Rich Brubaker, founder of Collective Responsibility, here to another episode of the Mission Driven Podcast. Through this podcast, I'm speaking with mission-driven entrepreneurs, investors, academics, and the wider ecosystem. So in this episode, I'm extremely honored to be joined by Jit Bhattacharya, who's the co-founder and CEO of Basi-Go. Basi-Go is a company headquartered in Nairobi, Kenya, working to electrify Africa's public transportation system. Jit has a long history of electronic vehicle and lithium-ion battery technology experience over the last 15 years, where he served as the CEO of Mission Motors, a Silicon Valley company dedicated to high-performance EV technologies, as well as later serving as a senior manager for special projects group at Apple. Jit, thank you very much for taking the time to join us to share a little bit about your insights, your experience, and what it is that you're working on over there at Basi-Go.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, Richard. Our mission is to create the future of clean electric public transport here in Africa. Where did this come from? Well, so here in sub-Saharan Africa, public transport buses remain the primary mode of transport for the vast majority of people. So 40% of all passenger trips across the continent are taken by bus. This is the most affordable and accessible mode of transport for the vast majority of people. It's also incredibly polluting. When you're here in an African city, the most common sight you will see is a bus driving down the road, belching black soot. In April of 2020, we had this amazing experience here where for a period of 3 days at the very start of the COVID pandemic, the government stopped all the buses from running. And almost overnight in the city of Nairobi, air completely cleared, and we were able to see Mount Kenya 350 kilometers in the distance. And what that did was it gave us this glimpse of what would happen if we could actually clean up the public transport sector. And that really became the inspiration for us getting started with Basi-Go and saying, we can't wait for some future date to do this. We should do this now.
Backing up a little bit, what got you into electric vehicles and clean tech to begin with?
Well, I'm an engineer by training. And as an engineer, I think there are few things you can work on that are quite as exciting and intoxicating as being able to work in transport. And what we have seen in the last 20 years is pretty much one of the biggest transformations in the automotive industry in decades. And when I first got involved in the sector, going back to 2007, starting to learn about lithium-ion batteries, starting to learn about the business case for electric vehicles, it became clear that this was going to be something that I wanted to be part of. Also because of the challenge, electric vehicles, they're not always an obvious economic solution. You have kind of two worlds. You have the world where people are buying electric vehicles, because they're just awesome. They're so much fun to drive. They're incredible, right? But also because people want to be able to say, yeah, this is the right thing for us to be using now. We need to break free of fossil fuels, all of this. But then you have the other side, and that is people making the transition to electric vehicles purely for economic reasons. But that's only happening in a subset of cases.
Okay, so you're looking out the window, you can see, a mountain 350 kilometers away. That's a long way away from starting an electronic bus company. Or electric bus company. So what were the initial steps after that like?
I think what was amazing about starting Basi-Go was it was the culmination of what I'd been learning about the EV industry since 2007. So for so many years. And some of those I just kind of touched on, right? Like where you had these two worlds. In the US, where I came from, Silicon Valley, we were so focused on Tesla, we were focused on passenger vehicles, but we're like, yeah, but the economic case isn't there, at least without subsidies. So what was exciting, and then on top of that, we were like, well, how can we also maximize the climate impact of what it is that we were doing? So when we were looking at Basi-Go, what I started to realize is if you really look at the EV industry going back the last 20 years, where have EVs succeeded almost unbridled? And it's actually emerging markets. It's not the West. We always think of EVs as this really expensive thing. And so how could it ever work in emerging markets? And yet the EV industry has thrived in emerging markets. It's just in a different type of vehicle. It's usually on two wheels, for example. So e-bikes, motorcycles, three wheels for things like tuk-tuks, and then public transport buses and trucks. And the reason that it's succeeded in emerging markets, number one, is you have populations that rely on these modes of transport a lot more than private passenger cars. But two is because the economic case can be made, like the business case for those vehicle platforms fit really well with the advantages of electric. And we always knew that here in Kenya, we had one other huge advantage, and that is 90% of Kenya's electricity is already coming from renewable energy. 90%. I come from California, we're at like 30%. Kenya's at 90%. And we also also have this huge surplus of renewable energy, mainly from geothermal, that is present at night. And when you put all of that together, you put together a business model where it makes economic sense from day number one. You're talking about that air pollution impact that we already mentioned, and then you're looking at 50 tons of CO2 per year for a single bus. You put all of that together and you go, this is something that absolutely needs to happen.
How did you know all that? Like, how did you get from 0 to 1 and be able to say like it's worth really putting in time, money, the next 10 years of your career? Like how did you do that research, if at all? And did you have a team that you already put together? What were those steps look like?
Right before starting Basi-Go, I was working as a venture capitalist, also here in East Africa. The fund I had worked for, we were one of the first investors in EV. So I'd definitely been looking at the space, and it was very clear that EV had potential, but nobody really knew exactly which applications. Two-wheelers was the obvious, but there was a lot of building enthusiasm for this sector. And so my co-founder, Jonathan, and I, we had previously been working in the energy access industry, working on financing small energy systems for individuals. And we said, well, could a model like that, like fundamentally the situation we had is we ran the spreadsheet, we ran the numbers using my technical expertise, and we said, yeah, the numbers absolutely work here. An electric bus is way more competitive than a diesel bus. But that's just what the spreadsheet is saying. We know that there's some fundamental problems. You talk about infrastructure. Infrastructure is one of the problems. The next problem is service and maintenance. How are you going to repair this bus if it breaks? But the biggest problem that we recognize from day number one is while the overall electric bus was much more competitive than the diesel bus over its life, the upfront cost of the electric bus is still a lot more. And this is classic in renewable energy, right? High upfront costs, really low operating costs. So you make that money back. But here we're working in a market like Africa. Cost of capital is really high. People are really sensitive to cash. And so, you go to somebody and go, hey, pay double for this product instead of your diesel bus. Don't worry, you'll make your money back in 3-4 years. I have yet to meet a private bus owner who'll take that deal. We were like, all right, there's a business here. And the spreadsheet absolutely says that it can work, but we have to address this core problem. And so this is where I say entrepreneurs are a bit crazy. For us, the jump from a spreadsheet to absolutely, we should do this, in hindsight, felt very, very easy and obvious. We'd been looking at it for a number of months, but honestly, I think it was like, yeah, we should just go ahead and do this. Like, it's so, why wouldn't anybody do this? And now in hindsight, and looking at the amount of work we put in the last 3 years going, yeah, we probably should have thought about that one more,
Okay, buses are expensive. What did the pilot look like? Because you had to prove that that your insanity was a bit sane and that it was scalable.
We started with buses are expensive. So that's the one thing. From day number one, we were like, we need to go through and raise capital. We were able to pull together through friends and family about $1 million of capital pretty quick. I had existing relationships with a number of the vehicle OEMs from China from my history in Silicon Valley. So I was able to actually get BYD, right, largest EV company in the world, to say, sure, we'll sell you this bus. It kind of meets the specifications that you guys want. And we're willing to sell you a couple of pilot buses. So we cobbled together $1 million pretty quick. What people were always very excited about with the business that we were pitching was the climate impact. That you're really looking at a model for electric buses where the climate impact is so much greater than an electric bus almost anywhere else in the world. That got us a lot of support from both angel investors, the early climate accelerators, things like that. And so, yeah, so we raised about $1 million. We were able to get those first buses on order. Even while those buses were getting built and delivered, we were able to pull in a little bit more capital, and those buses went into operation. So we founded Basi-Go in May of 2021, and our first 2 buses hit the road in March of 2022. So it took a little while. And in parallel to all of that, we had to do customer research. We were talking to customers, signing up the first 2 pilot partners. We were building the very first charging and service depot for electric buses. And this kind of shows another thing with being an entrepreneur in an emerging market. One of the things that's very common is you have to be vertically integrated in the beginning because our value chains are just not quite as mature. So you find yourself doing every single part of the value chain at the very beginning. And so we had to set all of that up to get those first buses into operation in March in 2022. And that pilot was critical because, like we said, we were just doing this off a spreadsheet. So we had a rationale for why we thought all our numbers in the spreadsheet were accurate, but that pilot was crucial for validating those assumptions.
what's the business model? How are you making money and bringing scale to this? Because your upfront costs are going to just keep growing with every bus, but you got to bring in the operation capital. So what's the business model that you see, and has that iterated as you've been over the last couple of years?
The most important problem to solve, the pain that operators have here, they all want to go electric, but it's that high upfront cost. So our solution to that, on the core to our business model, is what's called the pay-as-you-drive financing model. Through the pay-as-you-drive financing model, the operator doesn't have to go and make a big down payment, take out a loan to try and buy this bus. Instead, what they do is they pay us a small deposit, and then they lease the bus from us every single day based on the number of kilometers that they drive. So we are making it basically as simple as possible for these operators to be able to adopt that bus. Yeah, so people look at us and they oftentimes think we're a bus company. We always have to correct that. We go, no, the bus is coming from, this is Chinese technology for the bus. It's technology that already exists for the charger. Our innovation is actually all in the fleet management. It's in the asset management, and it's in that financing model where what we're doing is through the electric bus, giving a much higher return on investment opportunity. So great value proposition for the operators, 2 to 3x the ROI that they get from their diesel bus. A lot lower risk because they break even on that deposit within 1 year. And then on the back end of it, we're offering commercial rates of return for the investors who are helping us capitalize this lease. Yeah, at our core, that's the business model. Now, you also asked the question, did it iterate? And absolutely. When we first launched this business, we actually had a slightly different model. Here in sub-Saharan Africa, people typically don't like leasing. So the very first business model that we launched with was what we called a battery as a service model. Here, we were selling them the electric bus for the same upfront cost as a diesel bus. So that's how we were matching. But the reason we were able to do that is when we sold them the bus, we didn't sell them the battery. The battery would stay on our balance sheet, and we would finance the battery through that same mileage-based lease that I was telling you about. We always thought that was going to be the model that really took off. But immediately the clients started asking, well, hang on, why can't you just lease the entire bus to us?
Managing local infrastructure and the logistics of creating it, like how many chargers do you need? How did you have to build that out? Because I mean, Nairobi is one, it's a big city, it's congested. I'm sure they're not driving all back to your warehouse at night and then going home. Like what would it take to build the infrastructure so that you can get more operators to feel comfortable switching from, a consistent known fuel source into something that there's a little bit of anxiety in the early days?
Well, this is actually one of the huge advantages working in commercial vehicles like buses and trucks as compared to passenger cars. One of the problems the EV industry has suffered from the very beginning when you're focused on passenger cars is what comes first, the charging or the cars? You need both. And that has been such a difficult nut to crack. Commercial vehicles don't have that problem because of exactly what you described. They actually come back to the same place every single night. So our buses are driving from 5 in the morning until 11 at night, and then they come back in our pay-as-you-drive model to our depot. What's different about working in Africa is that our bus market is entirely private sector. There's no government involved here. And so I'll give you an example. Here in the city of Nairobi, we've got 20,000 buses. Those buses are mostly owned by individuals like you and me. And then those individual owners are organized into cooperatives. And there's 270 cooperatives in the city of Nairobi. And so what that means is these buses are spread across the city every single night, parking at gas stations, parking in private parking lots. And so what we need to do is then when we think about infrastructure and where these buses are going to sleep and charge, we have to position it relative to where those operators are already parking those buses. So that became the problem, but it also became a pretty exciting opportunity. So buses use DC fast chargers, and they're the same DC fast chargers that you'll see used for cars. What's happening now is because Basi-Go is putting these chargers spread out around the city, and right now they're only serving our buses, but in the years to come, when private passenger cars finally make their way into the market, we will have this DC fast charging network already there and available. So what you're going to see is cities like Nairobi probably leapfrogging AC charging for public charging and immediately moving to DC, which is just another huge opportunity.
But you must be inviting in some competitors who are trying to replicate you now that you've made this thing work. This ecosystem must be evolving. I mean, entrepreneurs are looking over the gate every time. So, what are you seeing, in like the last 2 years as you've grown from a couple buses to, 80 to 100 buses and more? Like, does that drive more competitors into the market? And then how do you build a moat around your model?
We are very lucky where we don't really have any competitors right now. In the electric bus space, we don't have any serious competitors trying to take our model. I think that's going to change in the next year. What is our moat? The biggest moat that we have is the complexity of what we're doing. So like I said, we had to vertically integrate in the beginning. And in a market like Kenya, that means we have to deploy charging. It means we have to do service and maintenance. It means we have to raise financing and capitalize these leases. But there's another big piece. We also have to locally assemble these buses in Kenya. And that's a big step. You can't just bring in a bus in order to be tax efficient. You actually have to bring it in as a disassembled bus and then locally assemble it. So we've got about a 3-year head start right now, which we feel pretty good about, even if competitors come in. But yeah, the moat is honestly the complexity of everything that we have to do.
That's fascinating. All right. So you're starting to prove this. It's a private market, but the government must be really interested in the implications for themselves as well. Public transportation, even if it's not publicly financed, it's still a public concern, and the government gets very involved. So how is this, what kind of conversations do you have, and how important is it to have a strong government understanding of policy or connections to government officials, so that as you're growing, you can understand what they're trying to do and then complement that, or that you can be open with them and they can learn, so they can create their own infrastructure that supplements your own. What's that relationship look like?
Even in a completely unregulated private sector market like we're dealing with here in Kenya, public transport is seen as something of a public good. And so absolutely, government is central to all of this. But I think in answer to that question, you kind of have to go back to what I was telling you about April 2022, and what is the priority that has really arisen in most African countries in the last couple of years. So what happened in April 2022? So you'll remember that the war in Ukraine had just begun. And then another thing that was happening is that the US was facing inflation, and so interest rates were starting to rise. And that's actually what led to this compounding fuel and currency crisis. The largest import for almost every African country in terms of the use of foreign exchange reserves, the largest use of FX reserves is the import of transport fuel. With the government conversation, that immediately meant that in countries across the continent, there became a priority to reduce the import of fuel and shift especially to domestic sources of energy for things like transport. So this was just an immediate win for the government. So the conversation with government, even in our private sector market here, is all about acceleration. What can the government do in order to help accelerate this transition, help us be even more competitive, help us accelerate how many vehicles we can bring in and build? And so that's really been the case, and it's been really positive.
Maybe a little bit more specifics. What do you see is happening from the government perspective that is supporting this transition? Like, what is it that they're able to do? Because if I'm listening to all the negotiations, they have no money to help. Okay, fine. But what else are they bringing that makes this easier for yourself and others to, transition from old into this new exciting space?
Yeah, you said the most important words. They don't have money. Most African countries don't have the balance sheet to do what we've seen in the West, which is direct subsidies. And yet we also live in a market, I think this one's very important. In Africa, we are feeling the brunt of climate change, especially Equatorial Africa. We are absolutely feeling the brunt of climate change. It's not some future reality. It is here today. And people care about climate change. People care about air pollution. They care about protecting the environment. But in this market, you cannot ask people to pay a premium. So any clean technology that you bring has to make economic sense from day number one. And so the conversation with the government right now about how they can help us is give us some temporary tax subsidies and things like that in order to help us just jump to that level of scale where we then don't need any subsidies at all and we can just compete head to head.
Realistically, what's your path to scale? Like, is it, get 30 in every country and then to 300, or like what's the mindset, or what's the idea to getting that done?
Now, in a business like ours, we always have 3 constraints to scale. So the first one, and always the one you'll hear from every African company, is capital. Getting the capital that we need in order to be able to scale is core to that. We've been incredibly successful, but now we're really getting into we're moving out of the realm of where we need tens of millions of dollars to where we're going to need hundreds of millions of dollars to be able to buy buses, to deploy charging infrastructure, all of this. So that becomes a really important problem for us to solve. The second problem, which is very much a Kenya problem, is manufacturing scale. Like I mentioned, we have to locally assemble these buses. So right now at our manufacturing, we have the first dedicated electric bus assembly line in Kenya. It's so exciting. It's one of the things that we're most excited to have built. And so that assembly line is currently producing at 7 per month. We have over 500 reservations in Kenya. So you can imagine we need to be producing a lot more than 7 per month. And then third, and something you'll hear from so many EV companies is we have the advantage where we can deploy charging alongside our buses because it's depot charging. But deploying that charging takes some time. At any given moment, we might have buses that are being made available. We have customers who want to put them into operation, but we're still getting the charging online. So our entire business now that we're through this early phase, the proof of concept is over. We are moving full commercial. How are we solving those 3 problems at any given moment? And now getting to the minimum efficient scale where we're profitable.
So the second 2 are things that are really internal that you need to bring up your own capacity, bring on more people, create process. The first one is the one where you have to pitch and find the right ear and find the right investors. And I'm curious, what has your funding process been like to date? Like, what are the stages in going to 100 billion? Like, how do you get there over time?
Yeah, we're entirely VCPE backed up until now. And the main reason that you had venture capitalists willing to go and take the risk on a business like ours was because A, the market size is enormous. B, it's a private sector market. And then C is the climate impact. And we say, look, in this evolving world, this is clearly, if these guys are right, then this is a transition that's going to happen and has to happen. And so, yeah, we're willing to take that bet. And so we've been mainly VCPE backed. What I can also share with you is that we're really excited. In the next few days, we are closing our Series A round. Our Series A round is going to be a $24 million Series A. And we're coupling that $24 million Series A with $22 million in debt from 2 development finance institutions, both of whom are going to be supporting our scale in Kenya and Rwanda, respectively. But that just solves the problem for a few hundred. Remember, the goal is 1,000 and ultimately many thousands. So a big part of our focus now is, while we've been venture capital and private equity backed up until this point to prove the model, when we think going forward, we really want to try and access a different type of investor, more what we would call like an infrastructure investor or project finance investor. This becomes one of the important problems for us to solve.
Okay. Fundamental question for the audience. In your mind, what's the difference between the types of investors? You can see like a climate tech fund would bring something different than the World Bank. And so how do you look at each one, and is one easier than the other? Or are they all differently difficult? Like, what's your strategy, or what's your, I don't know, your mindset around the different types of investors and who you like working with, and the different value that they bring to you?
In the end, we like working with any investor who believes in our model and our mission and helps us grow. But it's a capital ecosystem, and in a business like ours, you've got to match the capital to the type of growth that you have at that particular moment. So your venture capital, your private equity, they're the ones who are willing to take the very early stage risk, when all you are is a PowerPoint presentation and maybe a couple of buses on the ground. You have, in the long term, from the equity side, you have this more infrastructure, or what I call project finance investor, project finance equity investor, who can help you scale, but they're much lower risk, lower return expectations, but big tickets. And especially in a capital intensive business, in the energy, in the clean tech space, they're critically important. Here in Africa, we obviously have access to something that Western clean tech companies don't, and that's development finance institutions. So, these are groups like USAID, FCDO, the DFC, or BII or IFC, for example. One thing that I think that's so exciting is they're trying to get involved in earlier stage ideas. Small ticket, but they're willing to take that risk because of the development impact and outcomes that we can promise. To your question, in terms of who's easy to work with, who's not, I think the thing is, every single fund has its own thesis, has its own approach. And what you have to really figure out is, okay, how do we tune this, and either tune the way we're pitching this or the way that we're running this business to fit into the capital that's available? That becomes one of the problems of entrepreneurship. And it's especially present here in Africa, where we just have access to a lot less capital.
I've never done a funded company. I've always done organic. And for me, it's like, let's make more money. Let's grow a little bit. Let's make more money. Don't waste it. It's different than when you're fueled by investment. And I can imagine just a startup experience has to be a different conversation, right? Like you need to be thinking, I need VC, I need at this level. Here's how we're going to pitch it. This is what you have to prove. Do you actually go through that in your head and plan that out before you even put the first bus on the road?
Oh, you have. Yeah, you have to. And I envy you. I mean, I would love to have my next business be bootstrapped and to grow organically. Like that's the way to actually properly build a business. Make some money, grow a little bit, make some more. But in the world of climate tech, I think once again we have this other motivation, which is that we're so far behind on responding to the climate crisis that we need to be able to inject these technology and business model innovations into the market as quickly as we can. And that means venture capital. That means private equity. That means raising big amounts of money, or eventually even from the public markets. You always have to be thinking about that next investment round, and even oftentimes profitability is just a pit stop to that next significant amount of capital that you're going to go through and try to raise. It has to be there from the very beginning. I mean, I think you look at a business like ours, and the thing that was very clear, you just basic math. Yeah, you want to go and deliver 1,000 buses. You're talking about 150 to $200 million of capital that you're going to need in order to be able to do that in a market like Africa. How do we get to that quantum of capital? Where is it coming from? What do we need to prove in order to be able to make that case to that type of investor? It's there from day number one. And then there's just the reality, entrepreneurs in this space where you're venture capital driven, 80% of your time, you're raising money.
If you're spending 80% of your time on that, what's your success rate?
I think overall our success rate has been good because of the amount of money that we've raised, not just the Series A, but before that we basically raised $15 million of equity through a couple of rounds. So we've been very lucky, and I think it just speaks once again to the quality of the market size and the overall climate impact. But I will say the time it takes to raise money, the time from conversation to close has been the greatest barrier to growth for most startups out there right now. And even us who've been lucky, it's just taken a long time.
But I'm sorry, I'm not sure I buy that you were lucky, because you were able to walk into the right doors, present yourselves, pitch it right. And I'm curious, what do you think actually goes into building the luck that you're talking about? Because for me, I feel like you're creating your luck, you're creating your CV, you're creating your credibility, and then you're presenting that. I'm curious, like, what do you think goes into that an investor says, no, I'm going to trust you in a difficult market, in a bad financing round?
The fact that I failed 3 times before, that's number one. And coupled with that, you touched on another thing, the fact that I did get to dabble in the investment side. And that actually has had as big an impact. The fact that I know now what an investment committee is looking for, right? How these discussions go inside a VC or a PE fund, combining that with my entire experience from the likes of Mission Motors and other small startups that I started to do. I think that's when you ask, where did the luck come from? No, it's hard-earned experience.
All right, my friend, last question. Talking to an aspiring entrepreneur, mission-driven, who's looking to start something, what are a few pieces of advice you'd give them to get them a little bit further on the path?
I think the most important for especially a mission-driven founder is that term mission is central to the entire experience from day -30. So before you've even started the endeavor. If you are mission driven, it means you found a problem like we found with public transport here in Africa, where we looked at it, myself and my co-founder, Jonathan, and we said, yeah, this is obvious. I mean, yeah, it's obvious on the spreadsheet, but it's just so clear this needs to happen. Whether it's with us, whether it's with someone else, it's just so clear this transformation needs to happen. And you know what? Nobody else is doing it. We're going to be the first. And we always just fall back in the darkest moments, in the hardest times. You go, but what we're doing just needs to happen. Word of advice number 2 is you need to be thinking about business model from day number 1, especially true of climate ventures, but you should be thinking very clearly around, hang on, value proposition, competition, right? Like, all right, what does that mean in terms of margins? What does that mean in terms of how I can get to being a viable business? What you and I talked about, right? The business that can say, oh, I'm making money. Now I can grow organically. I don't need to raise investment, right? And I feel like sometimes in Silicon Valley, we've lost that perspective. It's been so much better from day number 1. We have been this is the exact business model we want to achieve. And everything else is now meant to go and serve that. The technology, in fact, we developed is simply meant to serve that. So those are kind of the 2 words of advice that I would give anybody who's starting out in this space.